In the early 1930s, Japan lacked the raw materials it required to become a major industrial power. To help them obtain the required raw materials, they began an imperial expansion which included Manchuria in 1931, Inner Mongolia in 1936, and other parts of China in 1937. In 1939, with the fall of France, they occupied French Indochina. This increased the tension between Japan and the United States and Britain. When both the United States and Britain enforced an oil embargo on the Japanese, they made plans to attack the United States and British forces in Asia. In December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. They also launched a number of successful simultaneous attacks on United States, British and Dutch territories, including Hong Kong, Thailand, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, Borneo and the Philippines. In 1942, the Japanese launched a number of further successful attacks on other colonial territories, including New Guinea, Singapore and Burma. As the Japanese were attacking Burma from Thailand, the British Far Eastern Commander, Sir General Archibald Wavell, hurriedly formed Burma Corps, consisting of two scratch divisions, the 1st Burma and the 17th Indian, in the hope of halting the Japanese advance towards the Burmese capital and major port of Rangoon. However, these troops were inexperienced, poorly trained and poorly equipped. On the 7th of March, the new commander of Burma Corps, Sir General Harold Alexander, ordered Rangoon to be evacuated to escape being encircled by the Japanese forces. The Japanese capture of Rangoon halted the supplies to the Chinese via the Burma Road. The Japanese then began to advance northwards. Burma Corps, now under the command of Lieutenant General William Slim, decided to evacuate his forces from Burma. On the 16th of April, around 7,000 Allied soldiers were encircled by the Japanese during the Battle of Yin Yang Yang and were rescued by the Chinese 38th Division. Burma Corps continued to retreat westwards over the Irrawaddy River towards the Indian border, operating a scorched earth policy as it went. And after a 900-mile retreat, the exhausted and shattered remnants of Burma Corps finally crossed the Indian border and reached Imphal in May 1942, just before the start of the monsoon, having lost most of their equipment and transport. Meanwhile, in the east of Burma, during the Battle of the Yan'an-Burma Road, the Chinese offensive to aid the British retreat, the Chinese initially checked the Japanese advance around Tungu. However, after the capture of the Burma Road, the Japanese were able to employ motorized troops to break the Japanese defensive line, resulting in the Chinese retreating either back through the mountains and jungle of Burma to China, where en route they lost many men, or to northern India, where they were put under the command of the American General Joseph Stilwell. Under the terms of their military alliance with Japan, the Thai army crossed the border into Burma on the 10th of May 1942. Armoured Thai troops, with support from the Thai Air Force, engaged the retreating Chinese, capturing Ken Tung on the 27th of May. The Japanese did not renew their offensive after the monsoon, for the Allied forces in Burma, building up their strength, was severely hampered, both the campaigns in the Middle East and Far East getting priority in terms of men and equipment, leading to them naming themselves the Forgotten Army. They were also required to deploy a large number of troops to quell anti-British protests and to help with the famine in Bengal. However, the Allies attempted to improve the training of their troops, but this was hampered by poor morale and disease. Towards the end of 1942, the Allies mounted two offensives. The first was the attempted recapture of the Mayu Peninsula and Yakab Island with its important airfield. However, repeated Allied attacks were repulsed with heavy casualties, causing Allied morale to sink further. The second Allied offensive was more controversial. This involved 3,000 Chindit troops commanded by Brigadier Ord Wingate. These were special operation troops formed to infiltrate through the Japanese front lines and march deep into Burma, with the objectives of cutting communications and destroying key targets. Although they managed to destroy some communication and transport targets, they suffered heavy casualties. However, the operation was used for propaganda purposes to demonstrate that Allied soldiers could fight as well as the Japanese in the Burmese jungle, which did much to restore the morale amongst the Allied troops. In 1943, Lord Louis Mountbatten was appointed head of the Southeast Asia Command. By late 1943, the situation for the Allies had begun to improve, with the introduction of better training and equipment, together with the growing Allied air superiority. Increased patrolling activity and night training was introduced to help the Allied troops lose their fear of fighting in the jungle. Allied troops became trained to form defensive boxes and to be resupplied from the air if they were surrounded or outflanked by the Japanese. They also received improved medical care, airlifting their wounded to hospitals in India. As a result, the health and the morale of the Allied troops improved considerably. Meanwhile, the Japanese had reorganized and created the Burma Area Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Kawabe. The new commander of the 15th Army, Lieutenant General Mutaguchi, had formulated a plan to mount an offensive against India, which was approved by the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Meanwhile, in 1943, the Thai army had advanced towards Xishuangbanna in China, but were driven back by Chinese forces. In October 1943, the Chinese 38th Division, commanded by Stilwell, began to advance from Lido eastwards towards China, while American engineers and Indian labourers worked to extend the Lido Road behind them. In February 1944, Operation Thursday was launched by the Allies, where the Chindits supported Stilwell by cutting Japanese communications in the region of Endor. In late April, Chinese forces totaling 75,000 men crossed the Salween River, followed by 12 Chinese divisions of 175,000 men attacking the Japanese 56th Division. However, this was checked by a strong Japanese counterattack. In the south, in early 1944, the Indian 15th Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Christensen, captured the small port of Mungdal. The Japanese counterattacked in force, infiltrating the lines of the Allies to attack them from the rear. However, the Allied forces held their position as they were supplied from the air, with the 5th Indian Division breaking through to relieve them. The battle resulted in a heavy defeat for the Japanese. In early 1944, the Allies had advanced with 2 divisions of the 4th Corps towards the Chindwin River, while leaving 1 division as a reserve at Imphal. They had received intelligence that the Japanese army in Burma had doubled in strength and were going to invade India in March 1944. Slim planned that when the attack happened, the Allies would conduct a planned withdrawal and fight a defensive campaign to break the Japanese before launching an offensive into Burma. However, they misjudged the timing of the Japanese attack. The Japanese 15th Army, commanded by Mataguchi, began their advance across the Chindwin River on March the 8th. The advanced Allied divisions were given orders too late to withdraw, which resulted in the 17th Indian Infantry Division being cut off at Tidham. However, it managed to fight its way back to Imphal by receiving supplies from the air and support from the Allied Reserve Division. To the north of Imphal, the 50th Indian Parachute Brigade was defeated by the Japanese 31st Division advancing towards Kohima, leaving Imphal vulnerable to attack from the north by the Japanese 15th Division. However, due to the success of the Allied attack at Arakan, Slim was able to redeploy the 5th Indian Division by air to reinforce Imphal and Kohima. By early April, the Allies were under siege in strong defensive positions in and around Imphal and Kohima. During the remainder of April, the Japanese launched several attacks, which were successfully repulsed. At the beginning of May, the Indian 33rd Corps began a counter-offensive north of Imphal. They made slow progress due to the monsoon rains and lack of supplies. However, the 2nd British Army Infantry Division had successfully pushed back the Japanese from around Kohima by May the 15th. After pausing for reinforcements, they continued their advance, and by the 22nd of June, the siege of Imphal had been raised. Although the Japanese continued to attack, they were near the end of their endurance, suffering a high number of casualties, with their troops hungry and with disease spreading amongst them. They began to retreat from Imphal in July. Imphal was the greatest defeat to date for the Japanese during the war. During the battle, they had suffered between 50 and 60,000 dead, with 100,000 more casualties. The Allies suffered 12,500 casualties, including 2,269 killed. During August 1944, the 14th Army began their pursuit of the Japanese. The Japanese replaced General Kawabe as commander of the Burma Area Army with General Kimura, as they withdrew behind the Irrawaddy River. On the southern front, for the 3rd time, 15 Corps advanced on Akyab Island. However, the Japanese were now far weaker and retreated. The island was captured by the Allies on the 3rd of January 1945. The Allies were now able to conduct amphibious attacks with the supply of landing craft and launch successful attacks on the Myborne Peninsula on the 12th of January and at Kengor 10 days later during the Battle of Hill 170 to cut the Japanese retreat. During the Battle of Ramey Island, from the 14th of January to the 22nd of February, there was heavy fighting in which most of the Japanese garrison died. In the north, although weakened by many Japanese troops being redeployed to the main front in China, on the 15th of December 1944, Chinese troops captured the city of Bamo. The 14th Army, now consisting of the 4th and 33rd Corps, conducted the main offensive into Burma. Early in 1945, the 33rd Corps seized crossings over the Irrawaddy River near Mandalay, while late in February the 4th Corps seized crossings at Nyangu. The 33rd Corps captured Mandalay on the 20th of March. The Allies now raced to capture the Burmese capital and port of Rangoon before the monsoon. The Japanese rearguard delayed the Allies until April the 30th and covered their evacuation from the Rangoon area. Slim, fearing that the Japanese would defend Rangoon to the last man, organised Operation Dracula, the combined operation to take Rangoon at short notice. In addition to the 14th Army's land operations, Allied naval forces mounted a diversionary attack on Phuket in Thailand, while an amphibious attack was made by 15th Corps. On the 1st of May, a Gurkha parachute battalion was dropped on Elephant Point, and the 26th Indian Infantry Division landed by ship the next day. On the 2nd of May 1945, the monsoon rains began, with the Allies recapturing Rangoon that day. The capture of Rangoon essentially completed the Burma Campaign. Although the Japanese continued fighting and skirmishing with the Allied forces until the end of the war in September 1945.